Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our latest Department of Defense Information Analysis Center webinar titled Facial Recognition Performance and Its Measurement. My name is Steve Rutherford, and I have the privilege of being the director of the HDIAC, and today we are hosting Mr. Patrick Rother for this presentation. I want to begin by thanking all of you and saying that I'm grateful to all who have taken time out to join us during these challenging times. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center. The DTIC-IAC mission is to collect, synthesize, produce, and disseminate scientific and technical information to the DoD and federal government users. So if you've not checked out DTIC's website at www.discover.dtic.mil, take a moment to review those expansive services that they provide. Without DTIC sponsorship, this series of webinars just simply wouldn't be possible. So a few admin notes as we start out. Note that all the attendee lines have been muted. So if you have questions during the webinar, we ask that you submit them using the attendee chat box you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're going to work to save the last 10 minutes or so of this presentation to go over those questions and discuss them. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded, and a link for the recording as well as the slides will be available at the HDIAC website for later download. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Mr. Patrick Rother. Mr. Rother is a scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where he is responsible for work on biometric standards and testing. He leads the iris exchange, face recognition vendor test, and face and video evaluation programs for iris and face recognition technologies that support biometrics and national scale identity management. Additionally, Patrick co-chairs NIST International Face Performance Conference on Measurement, Metrics, and Certification. He also assists a number of U.S. government agencies in research, development, and evaluation in these areas, and he's had the opportunity to brief countless senior government officials as well as the Defense Science Board. He serves as chair of the SC37 Committee on Biometrics, and he's the editor of 6 International Organization for Standardization standards. Patrick also edits the biometric specifications for the U.S. government's Personal Identity Verification Credentialing Program, for which he received the Department of Commerce Gold Medal. He also received the International Electrotechnical Commission 1906 Award in 2009 and the American National Standards Institute IT Medal in 2013. You can see it as our distinct honor to host him today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Patrick.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you for the invitation to present today. I will show you maybe 45 slides or so over the next 30, 40 minutes. And it's covering face recognition and particularly performance and how you measure that performance. This is work that we've done at NIST since the late 90s, tracking the evolution of face recognition technology. And it's NIST is a measurement lab, part of Commerce. Everything we do tends to be published and is fully open on the NIST website and in academic journals. So this slide includes a graphic up at the top, and I've put that there to show that if you're expecting a single answer for what face recognition performance is today, then you should think again, because obviously it's going to depend on the kinds of images that you try to recognize. And there's been an expansion of the industry over the years. As algorithms have improved, you want to move further to the right in the kinds of images that you're willing to accept into your ecosystem or system. But ultimately, as you can see on the right, if you turn the lights out completely, face recognition will break and you will get 100% error rate. But we'll get to that. So we're talking about face recognition. So what's in a face? Well, that seems like a simple question. And yeah, sure, there's everything that we consider to be a face. But also, if you look more closely, you could see the iris texture and information in what's called the periocular region around the eye. And there's a whole industry built up on doing iris recognition, and they use dedicated cameras. In this case, you can see my iris texture just about in this image. But in dark brown eyes, you don't see iris texture, so you need an iris camera with infrared illumination to get there. But in principle, this information is accessible for face recognition, in principle. Likewise, you might see skin texture, and patent was awarded 2004, 2005 on the availability of information, biometric information in skin texture on the cheeks and on the forehead. It turned out to be quite useful for identification, and I'll return to that a bit later. It's not often used today because you need quite high resolution, and you need to know that you've got high resolution, and oftentimes you don't. Also, you could see in that photo, we've got information about head shape, about the shape of the ears, scars. There are 2 scars on my left side. And I draw your attention to a standard on how humans should review faces when they are making identification decisions. And I mention that because automated face recognition, which is the subject of the presentation today, often will end up in the lap of a human when some kind of candidate identity needs to be reviewed. And we'll get to that a bit later as well. What else is there? Well, what you see is a 2D visible image that you will take with a cell phone or a typical camera. But if you were to use a FLIR camera or some kind of thermal camera, then you might see different things. And hyperspectral wavelengths, 3D cameras would give you shape information, depth information that would be additional. And so the face is not exactly just a simple thing. There is information there, and algorithms proceed by extracting that information. At the core of a face recognition operation is a comparison. So we've got 2 photos here. One was a very famous cover on National Geographic in 1984, and the photographer Steve McCurry made a trip back to Afghanistan in 2001 or so to find the original Afghan girl, a woman called Sharbat Kula. And he found her, but wanted to be sure. So this article discusses biometric comparison of 2 samples, 2 faces, and also 2 irises, because she has quite stunning irises. And you can notice some reflections here, which is why you would use infrared illumination and an iris camera if you were going to do iris in a general purpose way. But the goal is compare 2 photos and come up with a confirmation of identity. And that is exactly what happens on a current iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy phone, and maybe some others. These things are closed systems because we don't actually know how they work and what might be going on. There's a rich set of sensors that are built into these phones. And it might not just be using a 2D classical photograph. It could be using 3D information or, in principle, other information. It could be using video. And what you get is a comparison of the enrolled sample that you've stored in your phone with a live sample from whoever picks up your phone. So again, we've got comparison, and we've got potential to make a false negative where your phone doesn't open and a false positive where it opens for the wrong person. There's a whole industry built on that comparison operation that is built on standardized 2D photos. So if you fly to London or to Sydney with a US passport today, you can walk through immigration without talking to anybody by doing face-based authentication in these e-gates by presenting a passport. 2 images are involved, one from a live gate and another one from the chip on the passport or the PIV card that many of you will be familiar with in the US government. At the core of the operation is compare 2 faces and say, is it the same person or not? And I'll leave it to you to try and figure out, is that the same person or not? And that is a hard problem for people that you don't know. And if you're looking at this slide right now, then you might start doing those what's called morphological operations that I mentioned in the previous standard on the previous slide. And you will try and figure out and use visible cues to figure out if it's the same person or not. Face recognition algorithms are not really working that way. They are using neural networks, but I'll break the suspense and tell you right at the bottom there that these are actually sisters. My colleague May An and her sister. And recognition is quite difficult because they are obviously related. And we'll return to that issue as well a bit later. So there's an industry. It is what's called two-factor authentication. You have a passport, possession of a token, and you have possession of a biometric, something that you present, and you want to reject people who try to use your passport erroneously. How does face recognition proceed? Two photos, as I said, you're comparing them. You put each one into a black box, which is usually identical, box number 1. That thing is extracting identity information from the face. It is not extracting age information or sex information or any other kind of information. It is solely focused on extraction of identity-related information. It encodes that in a feature vector, known in the industry as a template. They get compared by usually quite a simple step, also a black box. Box number 2, which emits a similarity score. And you say that if it's a high score above some threshold value, then you're willing to say it's the same person. Otherwise, you really go inconclusive and you hold that it was probably a different person, and you wouldn't open an immigration gate in that case. These are built on deep convolutional neural networks, built using machine learning techniques. They are most definitely not commoditized. There's a lot of trade secrets in these things. The feature vectors are encoded typically in about 2 kilobytes, but there's a range on that from as little as, say, 200 bytes to maybe 4,000 bytes. That feature extraction process lasts from about 1/10 of a second to 1 second on an Intel server class CPU. You don't need GPUs to do this. The templates that are produced, these feature vectors, are reversible in the sense that you can manufacture, reverse an image from that template that may not look to a human as though it would be the same person, but it would look to an algorithm as though it was the same person. That is a difficult step to do. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is possible. Typically, images are retained in biometric systems to avoid vendor lock-in because the templates are proprietary. We covered this one pretty much. This kind of system is dependent on a trusted passport. You shouldn't be able to fake a passport, and you shouldn't be able to install what's called a morphed image on that passport, where you use a graphics package to combine a photo of 2 individuals and put them on a passport. That is an active evaluation program that my organization is running at the moment, but I won't talk about it again today. The recognition task can result in false accepts, where you let the wrong person through. That's a border security problem. And false negatives, which leads to some inconvenience for a traveler in this case. We have, as I said, have tracked face recognition technology for 20 plus years now, and we've been putting out reports. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been doing that approximately monthly. And we summarize those reports with what's called this leaderboard here. And we list algorithms down this axis, and we list different data sets with different performance metrics across the top. And so the red box here contains the fraction of border crossing transactions that don't succeed when you set quite a high security level. And the most capable algorithms on this slide, which was current as of a couple of months ago, the most accurate algorithms were from the Chinese company SenseTime, another Chinese company, Deep Glint, a company in Silicon Valley, Paravision, a Russian company, Vision Labs. And it runs all the way down. And some of these algorithms are a bit older than others, and these error rates can be quite low or they can be quite high. So there is a buyer beware aspect. Again, this table is on our website. You can go to the web page and you can look up different kinds of data sets. That table, if you were to have looked at that over a 3-year period, shows substantial gains in accuracy. And this is one particular slice of that space, and that is for a company in Paris called IDemia, one of the largest providers of biometric equipment. And we measured their algorithm sometime in mid-2017 as giving a 13% error rate on some verification tasks. So think of it as a border crossing task. And as time goes by, that authentication error rate has dropped by a factor of 20 or so to be now about 0.6%. And that turns out to have real practical consequences if you're running an immigration gate or you're trying to identify mugshots or visa photos. And how did that happen? What does this actually mean physically? It means we use the same database, this blue line, over time. And now 13% of the images can be recognized, almost 13% can be recognized where they couldn't before. That is because the algorithms coming out of this developer, and this is a typical example, it's not a special example, are much more capable. They are more tolerant of the kinds of variations that appear in images than they used to be. So they will see through image quality problems of the kind that I showed you on the first slide, and they will authenticate well regardless. And that has been possible by essentially a virtuous circle going back 20 years, which involves box number one, development of tools for scraping the web access, the advent of convolutional neural networks, test programs run by my organization and others, the advent of digital cameras, social media, cell phones, posting those photos to social media, machine learning tools running on GPUs that became ever faster, benchmark test sets, different architectures in the literature for building a convolutional neural network, and then culminating in these tests that I just showed you. Does this technology actually work? We wrote a report in, I think, 2018 or so, saying that there had been an industrial revolution. We pointed out that accuracy today is an order of magnitude. It is a factor of 20 or 30 better than what it was when we started doing that kind of test in 2010 and 2012. There's been an industrial revolution due to the adoption by the industry of convolutional neural networks. What is a convolutional neural network? They are typically depicted like this. They are layered structures whereby an image goes in, some image processing operation, that's this box in yellow, is applied to the image X. This is a convolution operation in this first layer with a set of weights, parameters that are learned, and that is fed to a second layer. So the output of the first layer goes to the second layer, which also extracts identity information and combines it using a set of weights, again, which are learned. And it proceeds with through these various layers to produce that feature vector that I told you about earlier. All of this is dependent on training data. This is called supervised training. And the goal is to be able to distinguish different individuals and at the same time put together the same individual in two different photos. And there's a lot of intellectual property that goes into these things, which we evaluate. So that's all I'm going to tell you about how these things work. This is not something that NIST does. We evaluate, we don't build. But there's a sort of a bigger picture here of multi-biometrics that we Many parts of the US government, for example, will collect faces, but they will also collect fingerprints. So they might engage in multimodal biometrics. You could also use a different sensor. This is an emissive IR sensor, long wave. So you're seeing thermal emissions from the face. Is there biometric information in there? Could it be combined with visible light information or 3D information on the right there? You can also take multiple photos, perhaps at different angles, and call that multi-instance that would be taken essentially simultaneously. Or you could aggregate information over time, longitudinal information, what's called repeated instance. You might also run multiple algorithms on data, algorithm A, algorithm B, and do this process called fusion. That is a short landscape of multi-biometrics, and it's quite powerful for improving accuracy and security. I covered that slide, I think, already. Mostly I referred just now to one-to-one comparison, opening your phone or crossing a border. The larger market segment for face recognition is one-to-many, which is a search typically of a database. And the issue of how big you can build a database is something that I'm going to show you in just a second. One-to-many is used in a whole number of applications, what I've called high-volume applications, where there are many searches per day, say in detecting fraudulent passport applications or visa fraud or national ID in countries that run national ID systems. Casinos use it for looking for various persons of interest. Aircraft boarding, CBP is piloting this, and other organizations around the world to replace the boarding pass and just look at a camera and board the plane or not. Surveillance is built on this high volume applications. And human review in those cases is usually intended to be infrequent, that the system would make a decision and maybe a door would open or it would get flagged to some kind of adjudicating officer. But in contrast, there's what you might call low volume applications. If somebody robs a bank, for example, you might have one video clip and you're going to search a database and you would pore over that video with human adjudication for the purposes of investigating a crime. You might also do such a thing for clustering media. So if you've got 50 photos and you want to find out how many people are in those photos, you might do some kind of clustering operation. How does one-to-many work? I'm going to tell you how it doesn't work. There is no magical knowledge in a face recognition engine of Patrick. So if a photo goes in, it doesn't come out with a rendition that says, this is Patrick, because it doesn't know anything about me. Instead, you have to populate the face recognition engine with, again, templates, feature vectors extracted from people who are passed to it in a prior enrollment step. And face recognition one-to-many searches are built on a comparison operation. So the title of this slide is a one-to-many search is implemented as n one-to-one comparisons. Sample comes in, features are extracted, and you compare them with a whole set of features that have been stored in a database, typically from n different people. And usually an exhaustive search would be done, and what comes out is a sorted candidate list. And it comes up with various identities, and a similarity score might be available too. And this is just a list of hypothesized identities, some of which would be right and some of which might be wrong. So there are two categories of error associated with doing this. False negatives, where you don't find me in a database that I'm in, and false positives, where you match somebody against the database, they're not in that database, and yet you say they are. So that would be false positive. There's a trade-off between these two error rates, and that can be evaluated. I've said sometimes on the title of this slide because there are some fast algorithms and clever algorithms that don't actually search all photos in the database. they used a set of fast search algorithms that can make this search very, very fast, microseconds or milliseconds to search 1 million records. And we publish numbers on that on our evaluation reports. Okay, so now a demonstration of how well face recognition can work. This is an experiment we ran now 18 months ago, I think. We put 104 million photos into a database, the feature vectors extracted from those photos, and about 32.6 million people. So that's something, I think, larger than the state of Texas, the population there. And that's about 3 photos each. We put them in a database, and they were border crossing photos, so they looked a little bit unconstrained. I'll show you a few more examples on the next slide. And then within that database, we ran 2 kinds of searches. 2.3 million high-quality visa photos and of people that are in the database. And that gives us an estimate of the miss rate, more properly known as the false negative identification rate. It's always necessary as well to run people who aren't in the database, non-mated searches, 1.8 million of those, again with different visa photos, give you an estimate of the false positive identification rate, also known as the false alarm rate. Now, we used the enrolled database of 100 million photos. These kinds of photos, these are examples that are very similar to what we used. And they have, as you can see, various image quality problems. Illumination and some cropping, and the person's not necessarily looking at the camera. There's too much compression. The green one here is about as good as these photos get. When we first started looking at photos like that in 2004, the error rates associated with that database were about 60%, because in about 60% of photos, the algorithm wouldn't find the face of the person in the image. Fast forward, and I'll show you the results on the next slide. Things have improved. So let's just look at the red text here. 2 different algorithms, one from NEC that was submitted to NIST. It's a company in Japan that was submitted to NIST in November of 2018. Another one from a company in Colorado called Rank 1. And they searched those databases, and they found they didn't find the correct result 0.4% of the time and 2% of the time. That means they found the correct image 99.6% of the time and 98% of the time. So that says that you can search a database of substandard photos with a nice photo, and in a population the size of Texas, and you can get the correct result most of the time. That's not the whole story. That is what's called the Rank 1 performance metric. So that candidate list that gets searched, you've got one of the 3 images of each person is returned at Rank 1, 99.6% of the time here. If you want, if instead you're running a high volume application like a casino, you wouldn't run a casino with 30 million people, but if you were, and you targeted a false positive rate of 1% only, again, this is this error rate trade-off between false negatives and false positives, then this error rate ascends to 0.6% from 0.4%. And so 99.4% of the time, you would get the right answer, and while incorrectly flagging only 1% of people who weren't in the database. So that is a demonstration of sort of recent capability of algorithms. Algorithms vary in their capability. Both of these developers have now produced more accurate algorithms since we ran that benchmark. But there is something to take note of here. That if we look at the trade-off between false positive, false alarm rates on the x-axis and false negative rates, how often you don't find the correct person. If you insist, if you demand very low false positive rates by cranking up the recognition threshold, then you will get these large increases in false negative rates. What that is saying is that low false positive rates are not accessible in face recognition. And that can be because databases have got identity errors in them. There could be two photos of a person under two different identities. But also it's to do with when you search a large population, you will find instances of twins, something I'll cover in just a minute, and siblings and family members of people that tend to look the same, which mean that false positives can't be minimized. They can't be eliminated. The same would occur with DNA. DNA would give a match on identical twins, and that's what makes DNA useful for doing familial relationship matching, which is used in criminal investigations also. But so that was a demonstration and also an identification of weakness. Results like that are included also on a leaderboard. The web page is at the bottom there. And we've got various different data sets, FBI mugshots, FBI to CBP border crossing, border detention photos, different population sizes, a database that's more appropriate to sort of entry-exit processing. And on the going down the column here, we've got various algorithms. And you can see at the bottom of these rows, the error rates can extend up to like 85%. So there's some algorithms are not giving good performance depending on what the database is. So to sort of summarize, what is the state of the industry here? There's been a massive expansion of the industry built on new algorithms, massive gains in the accuracy, which we've documented, better tolerance for poor quality images, better tolerance of aging, which I'll show you in just a second. You can operate in large databases. There's a worldwide set of developers. Accuracy varies across developers, so buyer beware. You have to configure algorithms with a correct threshold depending on your tolerance for false positives. There is standardization activity, which I'll get to in just a minute. And there are some limitations, which I'm going to walk you through on the next slides. So the first one is aging. Unfortunately, we all age. Things don't stay the same. So a photograph of me taken in 2002 doesn't quite look like a photograph of me taken in 2018. 16 years of aging there, my facial appearance has changed, and an algorithm is supposed to ignore those changes and just see identity. But practically, that is a very tough task over an extended period of time. And the change in the appearance of the face will cause similarity of me to an original photo of me to degrade. So that's my lifespan. On the bottom row here is a Russian agent who was implicated in a assassination attempt in England a year ago or 2 years ago in Salisbury, and some old photos of him. And so the joke when I present this slide has been, is aging in the US government as bad as aging for a Russian spy? And I'll leave that for you to decide. One job is better than another. So faces change, similarity scores degrade. So we ran a test using mugshot photos over about a 17-year time span. And we plotted the distribution of the similarity scores over all those comparisons. And there's, I think, 3.1 million comparisons. No, 10 million comparisons, I'm sorry. A database of 3 million. And the similarity scores, as the time separation between the photos changes, similarity scores degrade to the point that this red distribution, the error rate is very high because those scores are below typical operational thresholds on one-to-many searches. So now you will get something like a 50% error rate from this one Russian algorithm over an 18-year time span. Contrast that with a Microsoft algorithm, and again, it's sliding downhill over time, but the error rate is still substantially lower. The error rate has gone up, but it is still low relative to these operational thresholds. So we've produced that kind of data, we published that kind of data for multiple algorithms. These are broadly showing the same thing. Mileage varies. Buyer beware. Be careful which algorithm you procure. Some algorithms are better at 18 years than other algorithms are at 2 years. So innate capability of algorithms varies. I won't walk you through this slide much more because we have this slide here, which is a bit more difficult to interpret. So I'm trying to tell you on this slide what is more important to recognition outcomes. Is it the size of the database you're searching, or is it aging? On the left side, we have 5 different enrolled population sizes, 640,000 up to 12 million. On the right side, we have aging in a fixed database size, again up to 17 or 18 years. On the x-axis is the error rate when we do searches, how often you don't find the correct individual. And on this vertical axis is all the different algorithms that we've evaluated at the time we made this figure. You can see that error rates go up with database size, but quite modestly compared to the increases in error rates you get with aging. At the top of the slide, you can see some algorithms barely register any errors with database size or with aging relative to some others. So this is a sort of a visualization to try and show that aging is a more influential factor than the number of people that are put in a database, at least using good quality images. This is a recent study that we've run on face masks. What happens when you occlude 40 to 70% of the face? Obviously, that is not going to be a good thing for face recognition. What we did is we took existing algorithms that existed pre-pandemic, and we covered the face with synthetic masks of various kinds. And as you can see on this slide, we varied the coverage of the mask, the shape of the mask, and the position, essentially the position over the nose. And I think we also changed the color of the masks. We applied these synthetically. We couldn't go out and gather a database of a few million without spending an awful lot of money. So we did this in software with these not quite realistic masks, but they gave us a first order estimate of what happens to face recognition. We used a set that I showed you earlier of visa photos compared with border crossing photos, for which we maintain a benchmark. And what we plotted on this graph here is the false negative rate without masks for various algorithms. Each algorithm is a dot on this graph here. False negative rate without masks and false negative rate with masks. The x-axis ranges from about 0.3% to 5%. So that is just commercial capability on unmasked images. However, on the vertical axis, you see that accuracy is going from about 2% up to about 80%. And in the brown rectangle here, you can see that competitive algorithms below 1% without masks are giving 20, 30, 40% error rates with masks. There are exceptions in the circles at the bottom, and those algorithms are quite useful, are likely to be still useful. They're giving recognition error rates that could probably be used in authentication today. We've continued to run that study over recent weeks as new algorithms have come in, post-pandemic algorithms. And there has been concerted development efforts to produce algorithms that will authenticate masked images and unmasked images. And any given application, you might encounter people wearing masked images or not, or unmasked images. So As you can see at the bottom of this slide, the failure rates can go up to, say, 65% here. Some algorithms are just not suitable for deployment on people potentially wearing face masks. Demographic effects. This has been in the news extensively over the last couple of years. We ran a study reported in 2019 on race, sex, and age. There are other demographic covariates, the height of the person, other things. Is it an algorithm problem or a camera problem? Are we talking about one-to-one or one-to-many? Is the problem false positives or false negatives? What are the implications for different applications? So we used various different data sets. It was a big report. We included results for 187 algorithms from 99 developers. We looked at both one-to-one and one-to-many. And sort of the headline result is going to appear in the next couple of slides. And a preview of that is this figure provided by Apple for the Apple Face ID system in about 2017. They deployed it and they claimed a false match rate of 10 to the minus 6, 1 in a million false positive rate. Okay, so the chance of somebody picking up your phone and being able to unlock your phone is 1 in a million. However, within a few weeks, this web page still exists. They included this text: the statistical probability of a false match is different for twins and siblings that look like you and among children under the age of 13. And so what Apple is saying is that young people and twins and siblings can give you higher false positive rates and that the phone shouldn't be used. So that's a declared instance of a demographic differential. Nevertheless, it's obviously better than using a phone with a pin or using a phone without a pin at all. In our study, we produced, using a worldwide set of visa photos, of high-quality visa portrait photos, we found false match rates in Caucasian population in Poland to be about 1 in 30,000, with a dependence on age of the people in the two photographs. And in the worst case, we found at that same recognition threshold for this one particular algorithm, we found that the false match rate for elderly Chinese women could be about 1 in 30. But that's a factor of 1,000 increase in false match rate. And this anecdotally had been reported to us by border agencies who noted that when they got false positives, they tended to come from particular demographics. And our demographic report made the point that these false positive rates and false negative rate dependencies are quite algorithm specific. So the recommendation was to know your algorithm. And you need to characterize demographic effects and other sensitivities of algorithms. You always have to think through the consequences of errors. And so dispensing drugs is a non-repudiation task, usually done with fingerprints, but it could be done with face. It's a bit different from boarding a plane. Different security consequences, different consequences of error. And that is, in turn, it's different from running some kind of watch list system looking for soccer hooligans or a counter-terror application or compulsive gamblers. So in all cases, you have to think through the consequences of error and your targeted false positive rates, and then who would be harmed by demographic differentials of the kind that Apple reported and that we reported for age, race, and sex. So in short, I guess I'm running a bit low on time. Leading contemporary algorithms are accurate. There are demographic differentials. False positives turn out to be much more variable and large than false negative differentials. One-to-many algorithms don't necessarily behave like one-to-one algorithms, so you can't look at a one-to-one algorithm and say something about a one-to-many search necessarily. The algorithm itself matters. The consequences of errors can be sort of essentially inconsequential, or they could be quite grave. There's quite a lot of poor reporting in the press about this demographics issue, so we tried to address that. The last topic I think we're going to cover here is twins, and I called them a forgotten demographic. 1 in 30 live births in the United States in 2015 were twins of one kind or another. There's identical twins, which are more rare. There are fraternal twins, which are more common and becoming more common with various trends, sociological trends. This prevalence of twins varies considerably across the world. This is an issue because if you put, we ran an experiment with a database of mugshots, and we added to that database an image of one twin. We searched that database with the photograph of the other twin. And in all these cases, for 3 of the more mature algorithms that we evaluated, it finds the twin at rank 1 with quite a high score. A similar thing happens with fraternal twins, but with a weaker score. Some fraternal twins are a different sex, in which case they are typically not found by the algorithm. So what we've got is a false positive risk from twins in face recognition. And I made this point earlier on sort of the large-scale demonstration that twins and lookalikes, siblings, mean that low false positive rates are not achievable with face recognition alone. If we had more information on the face, like skin texture, you would have more discriminative power, because skin texture is not, as far as we know, genetically linked in the same way that bone structure is. What you don't expect is if you were to make such a figure, an identification performance figure, for fingerprints or irises, you don't expect to see this increase in false negative rates, that you can achieve much lower false positive rates. So it's not expected with 10 fingerprints and 2 irises. Modality comparison, which is the subject of this slide, is a tricky topic. There are many attractive properties for face versus fingerprint versus iris, different strengths, different weaknesses, and it goes to the definitional properties of what a biometric is supposed to be doing for you. This is a sort of a snapshot. There's a nuanced discussion on each of these elements for the strength of a modality. And this is a snapshot view of the NIST face recognition vendor test. This is our set of 4 different benchmarks that are ongoing: one-to-one algorithms, one-to-many algorithms, morph detection algorithms, this particular attack on algorithms, and image quality assessment. Can you look at an image and say it's a good image automatically? A number of different products come out of that. These are public reports with an approximate schedule that I've included there. We tend to update this one about every month, this one about every quarter. Demographics report will also get updated at some point. Morph detection has been updated quite frequently. Image quality, we'll see an update, I hope, later this week. Face masks, we are actively tracking because it's obviously important, and we will also put out a report on ability to discriminate between twins. I've sort of covered that one. I'll draw your attention to one final topic, and that is to point out that most face recognition, not on a phone, but on, say, border crossing or mugshots, are collected with cameras that don't know anything about faces. That is in contrast to fingerprint and iris recognition, which use sensors that are purpose-built to look for fingerprint ridges and iris texture. Face cameras don't know much about faces. In particular, they don't recognize when somebody is not looking at the camera. They don't recognize when a photograph has no faces at all, or they have multiple faces. They don't correctly adjust necessarily for over or under exposure. They are not supporting human review adequately. They are not supporting morph detection adequately, and they're not supporting presentation attack detection. So there is an ISO standard now under development to incorporate, to require certain capabilities that should be built into cameras, that you can find out when somebody is not looking at a camera, You could count faces in a scene. You might do a better job of handling illumination, and you might collect better resolution, including resolution sufficient for skin texture. You might also address the ability to tamper with photos or spoof photos. So we have a conference covering many of these topics, October 27th through 29th. There's a very long URL. You should just Google NIST IFPC. It is free. We've got a world-class field of speakers on a number of topics. The agenda is still changing. Everybody would be welcome. NIST IFPC. This is something we ran in 2018, and we'll do so again, purely virtually, obviously. And I hope that's my last slide. Yep, my last slide. Happy to take questions if we have some time left.
We sure do, Patrick. We got a few minutes left. Thank you very much for that very in-depth presentation. So we have a few questions. One of them is from Walter Ezerins, and you kind of talked about demographics. He's talking about ethnicity versus where the actual algorithm is developed. His specific question is, how would, say, for example, a Chinese algorithm do when it's looking at folks of an Asian and then a non-Asian, perhaps an African descent?
Right. Great question. We produced some data on that in the report that we put out in December. We showed that some Chinese algorithms, not all of them, do not give higher false positives in Chinese faces. And that is a useful aspect if you're trying to recognize Chinese. Some of them gave higher false positives in Caucasian faces. So it is consistent with the training data mattering, that you learn local faces, and that you do need diversity in your training data.
Thank you for that. So Samuel White asked if NIST has data on accuracy in groups of people, say n equals 20 or more, passing a point at about the same time.
So this is like a choke point. You've got people walking through a physical environment. We don't have good data on that. I would direct you to DHS Science and Technology Directorate and their Maryland test facility. They have looked at precisely that kind of application for the purposes of getting people through airports quickly.
So Carl Holmes asked a question, interesting. He's talking about the cameras not in the visual spectrum, and he asks if a person's temperature change could cause concerns if, say, you had a FLIR camera or a multispectral camera.
We haven't. There are not very good studies on looking at non-visible wavelengths. The Army has done quite a bit of work on it. And what's really needed is a large population with a particular sensor in mind. Sensor will matter to this, and looking for identity cues in different wavelengths of light. It needs measurement. There have been some studies going back 20 years, but not large population studies. Using a camera for temperature measurement is a different activity than looking for biometric samples that can be used for ID.
Okay, so Laura Ruplet asks, can an algorithm account for both skin texture and bone structure on both 1-to-N and 1-to-1 cases?
So in conventional 2D images, these algorithms are being trained on large databases of photos, and those algorithms will be essentially promiscuous in what information they extract from photos. If there's reliable discriminatory information available in a photo or in a set of photos, those algorithms will find it. So are they looking for bone structure or shape or some kind of texture markings like presence of moles or or something to do with skin folds near the eyes is just essentially unknown. The algorithms will look for useful information automatically. And so that means that if you use a face recognition algorithm and you're going to depend on the outputs that it gives, you have an explainable AI problem, meaning you don't really know what features the algorithm used in coming to its sort of positive conclusion, if there was a positive conclusion.
So that actually leads to another question you were asked. Thomas Moroza, he's asking about what the role is in general, the function of artificial intelligence when augmenting facial recognition software and algorithms.
What is the function of artificial in augmenting, right? So AI techniques, machine learning techniques are being deployed for face recognition. There's been a big industry, biometric industry, built for many years on not using AI, particularly not using convolutional neural networks. In particular, fingerprints and iris algorithms weren't built that way historically. To answer your question, the face industry now is solidly built on facial recognition technology using convolutional neural networks. I'm not quite sure what was meant by augmenting, but yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
So one of the questioners asks, Mr. Elliot Weed, he wants to know what resolution, like you talked about in the very first slide, that the software and the algorithms getting better and better with worse and worse resolution. What resolution would you consider to be perfect?
Right, so I wrote down the specifications for the US government ID card back in 2005 or so. And that was an industry consensus process. And we mandated at that time 120 pixels between the eyes with quite light compression, benign compression. You have to be careful because compression can hide detail, can remove detail. Resolution is but one variable that you need to take care of. And various image quality defects can go wrong. People not looking at the camera, people compressing images too much, having inadequate illumination or too much illumination. There's a whole industry associated with finding faults in images. But on the narrow question of resolution, at 120 pixels between the eyes with modest compression, you can see skin texture, and you can see traditional sort of face recognition features, more global features.
So we've got time for one more question. I'm going to kind of combine two of them. One of the questioners asks about the effectiveness with children. What are the limitations with children? And then another limitation we were asked about is heavy beard growth. You know, if a gentleman were to grow a long beard, a particularly bushy one, or let it grow up high, what impact do you see that having?
Yeah, so beards has been a long-standing question. We are always hamstrung by not having enough data. What the masking study showed recently is that some algorithms seem to focus more on the region around the eyes that would be above a beard and above a face mask. And so to what extent does a beard matter? Again, it's algorithm dependent. And I think it would probably depend on if the beard was present in one photo and not present in an earlier photo. So change in appearance matters between the two images being compared. On children, there's some very nice work by the government of Australia on using passports of young children. And they showed that performance is improved quite a lot over the years. And we found that false positive rates in young children can be quite high, particularly very young children. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. I think that takes us right up to the hour. We're very appreciative of you taking time to prepare this brief and give it as well. We're very thankful for that. Your time is valuable, and we certainly appreciate it. So to everybody who joined us today, thanks a bunch. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar when I started out, the slides and the recording of this presentation will be made available for download at the HDIAC website. If you're interested in learning more about the IACs or getting involved as a subject matter expert, presenter, or simply expanding your presence in our HDIAC user community, please feel free to reach out directly using the contact information you're going to see show up on the left-hand side of the screen. You know, in addition to these monthly webinars, and we try to get 2 of these in a month, we also offer monthly podcasts. We publish 2 of those every month. We put out a biweekly email digest that contains the latest scientific and technical news. And we foster a technical inquiry service where we provide up to 4 free hours of technical consulting. You can find all of this information in the links on our website. And also, we can perform customer-funded work in any of our technical areas via our pre-competed IDIQ contract vehicle. So again, the contact information is included in the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen. I would ask that you please be sure to join us here in a week on 1 October for our next webinar that's titled Agnostic Compact Demilitarization of Chemical Agents, where our guest will be Mr. Daryl Johnson, and he'll be talking about his experience with this fascinating project and the work he did with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, more commonly known as DARPA. Finally, again, thank you for your time today. Thank you, Patrick. Like us and follow us on social media as well. Best regards, and I hope you all stay well.